She was a queen who walked out of the palace barefoot, bleeding, holding two infants against her chest in the dead of winter, and not a single man moved to stop it. That's the kind of story they don't carve into thrones. They bury it. But buried things have a way of growing roots. If you've ever been cast out by someone who is supposed to protect you, stay until the end, because this one's for you. Drop your city in the comments, hit that like button, and let's go. The torch nearest the great gate had burned low, just a guttering wick drowning in its own wax. And in its dying light, Rowan Ashcroft counted her breaths the way a soldier counts ammunition. 1, 2, 3. Because if she stopped counting, she would start screaming, and screaming was the one thing she could not afford tonight. The courtyard of Voss Keep was packed shoulder to shoulder. Every alpha lord who held territory from the northern ridgeline to the southern salt flats had been summoned for the tribunal of blood, and every one of them stood now in their ceremonial leathers, watching her. Cold air moved through the stone corridor and carried the smell of pine resin and old iron. Behind her, someone coughed into a gloved fist. The sound bounced off the walls like a stone dropped down a well. Rowan stood at the center of the courtyard in a dress she'd been wearing for 3 days. The fabric, white linen, Luna white, the color chosen by the palace seamstress to make her look pure and therefore guilty, had gone gray at the hem from the cell floor. Her feet were bare against the flagstones. They had taken her boots during the arrest because boots meant the capacity to run, and they wanted her to understand that she had nowhere to run to. Her arms were not in chains. The council had decided chains would generate sympathy. Instead, her hands were clasped in front of her, pressed flat against each other, and against the inside of her wrists she could feel her own pulse, fast, steady, animal. She had 2 sons. They were 13 days old, and they were in the nursery tower directly above this courtyard, and she could not hear them from here, and that was the worst thing. That was the thing she kept returning to. She could not hear them. High Counselor Breton stepped forward from the dais. He was a lean man with the kind of face that looked perpetually disappointed. Deep-set eyes, a mouth like a scar, hair gone entirely to iron gray. He held a scroll, but didn't unroll it. Rowan Ashcroft Voss, he said, and let the name settle like a dropped axe. Luna of the Voss Kingdom, you stand accused. She looked at him the way you look at weather, flat, patient, waiting. You stand accused, Breton continued, of conspiracy against the crown, of feeding intelligence regarding the Northern Pass route to enemy scouts, of deliberately delaying the mobilization orders that cost 47 lives at the Battle of Crestwall. Someone in the crowd shifted. Leather creaked. The torch sputtered. Those are lies, Rowan said. Her voice came out steady. She hadn't been sure it would. Breton's expression didn't change. He rolled the scroll slightly in his hands, the gesture of a man who had done this before and found it tedious. The testimony of Lady Seraphine Marin and 3 members of the palace guard. Lady Seraphine Marin is sleeping in my husband's bed, Rowan said. Which you know. Which every man in this courtyard knows. Which makes her testimony worth exactly what I expect you to record it as. A sound went through the crowd. Not a gasp, something lower, a shifting of collective weight. Breton's jaw tightened. That accusation is not an accusation. She kept her voice even. A fact. I have a letter dated 6 weeks ago in Seraphine's own hand describing in considerable detail a meeting in the East Wing that I was not invited to attend. I submitted it to this council. I note it does not appear to be part of your scroll. The silence that followed had texture. It pressed against the ears. From the dais, from his chair, not quite a throne, but arranged to function as one, Alpha King Darian Voss said nothing. He had not spoken since the tribunal began. He sat with his forearms resting on the chair arms and his eyes fixed somewhere slightly to the left of Rowan's shoulder. And he had the expression of a man reading the same sentence over and over and finding it meaningless each time. He was 34 years old. He was the most powerful alpha she had ever touched. She had touched him 10,000 times, and right now he looked like a stranger wearing his face. Darian, she said. Everyone heard it. She hadn't intended to say it out loud, or maybe she had. Maybe some part of her needed to watch him choose, needed to see it happen in real time instead of learning about it secondhand the way she learned about most things in this palace. He finally looked at her. His eyes were dark brown, almost black in torchlight, and they were completely unreadable. "The tribunal will proceed," he said. His voice was very quiet. The courtyard was so still that it carried to every corner. Rowan exhaled through her nose. There it was. Breton picked up the thread immediately, the way a well-trained dog retrieves. Given the severity of the charges and the testimonial record, the council recommends exile, said Seraphine Marin. She stepped forward from Darian's left, from where she had been standing just behind his chair, close enough that her hand could have rested on his shoulder if she'd reached. She was wearing deep red, which was not the color of a grieving woman and not the color of a neutral witness. She was tall and composed, and her hair was coiled at the back of her head in a complicated knot that had taken someone an hour this morning. "Exile is mercy," Seraphine said, addressing the council rather than Rowan, performing neutrality the way you perform a skill you have practiced. "She has borne the Alpha King's heirs. Whatever her crimes, the blood in those children is sovereign. Execution sets a precedent we cannot take back." Breton nodded slowly, as if this were new information and not a script they had rehearsed. Rowan looked at Seraphine, just looked. Seraphine met her gaze for 2 full seconds and then looked away. Looked at Darian, which told Rowan exactly where the center of gravity in the room was. "You're very good at this," Rowan said quietly. Not loud enough to be a speech, just loud enough to be heard by the people nearest her, which was enough. Seraphine's chin came up a fraction of an inch. "Whatever gives you comfort," she said. "Exile," Breton announced, rolling his scroll shut with finality. "Effective at dawn. The Luna Rowan Ashcroft Voss is stripped of title, rank, and all claims within the Voss kingdom. The children—" He paused. There was something in the pause that told Rowan this was the part of the script that had been argued over. "The children will accompany their mother into exile." She had been prepared for them to keep the boys. She had spent 3 nights in the cell building herself around that possibility, packing it into her chest like stone packing around a wound, because if she didn't, it would hollow her entirely, and she needed to be solid. She had told herself that if they kept Kale and Lucien, those boys would grow up in this palace learning what their father had done tonight, and they would either become the same kind of man or they would eventually come for her. She had told herself she could survive either. So when Breton said the children would go with her, something inside her cracked that she hadn't known was still intact. She didn't let it show. She had one skill left that they hadn't taken from her, and it was the ability to experience devastation without performing it. "You have 2 hours to gather belongings," Breton said. "A guard will escort you to the nursery and then to the eastern gate. You may take clothing, nothing else." "Nothing else," she repeated. "No coin, no horse, no weapons, and no correspondence. Your letters will be reviewed before any communication leaves this kingdom. Do you understand the terms of exile as stated?" She looked past him, past Seraphine. She looked at Darian. He was looking at his hands. "I understand," she said. The 2 hours moved the way time moves when the ground is falling away beneath you. In some places glacial, in others gone before you registered it. A guard named Torin, who had walked her morning routes with her for 2 years and taught her eldest brother's son to sharpen a blade, escorted her to the nursery without speaking. He kept his eyes straight ahead the whole way up the tower stairs. She appreciated that. She didn't want to see the conflict in his face because she didn't have room for his feelings alongside her own. The nursery smelled like lanolin and milk, and the particular warm animal smell of very new infants. There was a wet nurse, a young woman named Dell, who had been feeding both boys through the tribunal because Rowan had not been permitted to be here, who stood up when Rowan entered and immediately burst into tears. "Don't," Rowan said, not unkindly. "It doesn't help either of us." She went to the cradle. Kale was awake, dark-eyed and serious, the way he'd been since his first hour alive, watching the ceiling with the concentration of someone studying a map. Lucien was asleep against his brother, one small fist shoved against his own cheek. She picked them up, one in each arm, and stood there a moment absorbing their weight. 13 days. They smelled like the best thing she'd ever been near. "Pack everything in those 2 baskets," she told Dial. All the wrappings, whatever milk you have prepared, the warm blankets, the wool ones, not the linen, anything that fits. My lady, Rowan, she said, I'm not anyone's lady anymore tonight. Dael moved. Rowan stood with her sons and looked out the single narrow window at the courtyard below, which was emptying now as the Alpha Lords dispersed to their guest quarters to drink someone's wine and discuss what they had witnessed. She could see the eastern gate from here. It was already open. She had packed the letter, Seraphine's letter, inside the lining of Kyle's sleep blanket 3 days ago, when she first understood where this was heading. She didn't know yet what she would do with it, but she knew that documentation was the difference between a story that could be proven and a story that died with you. How much does a horse cost? Dael asked suddenly from across the room, her voice rough with tears she was working to suppress. More than I have, Rowan said. There's a man in the eastern settlement, not on the kingdom's rolls, runs a small operation just past the first tree line. His name is Holt. He owed a debt to someone who asked me once to remember his name. Dael paused. I'm telling you this because I don't know what else I have to give you. Rowan looked at her. Dael was 22, maybe, with red hands from the cold water she washed with and a face that was trying very hard to be composed. You've given me 2 weeks of feeding my sons, Rowan said. That isn't nothing. Dael made a sound in her throat and turned back to the baskets. Torin appeared in the doorway. It's time. The eastern gate of Voss Keep opened onto a road that became a track that became nothing. Beyond the track, the forest came down off the ridge in a dark wall, pine and bare oak interlocked like a fist, and the night sky above it was absolutely clear and absolutely cold, the kind of cold that meant business, that was not decorative. Rowan's breath came out white and dispersed. She stood at the gate with a boy on each arm, and the 2 baskets hung from her shoulders by straps Dael had fashioned from extra wrapping cloth, improvised, asymmetric, already cutting into her collarbones through the thin dress. And she thought, this is the moment people talk about when they say they hit bottom. What they don't tell you is that bottom isn't the end. Bottom is just the place where you either stop or you don't. She didn't stop. Shut the gate behind you, said the guard whose name she didn't know, the one who'd been stationed at the gate specifically so that it wouldn't be someone who knew her. She walked forward. The gate closed. She didn't hear Torin's voice among the guards. She didn't look back to check. The first 100 yards she spent adjusting to the weight. The boys, the baskets, the cold that was seeping up through the dirt into her bare feet like something alive. Her feet had stopped hurting, which she knew from things she'd read was not a good sign, which meant she needed to find something to wrap them in before she'd walked another hour. She unwrapped the outermost layer from Lucien's basket and stopped, crouching in the mud, and wrapped her feet in it. It wasn't waterproof, and it wasn't enough, but it was something between her skin and the ground. She tied it with strips of the wrapping cloth and stood back up. Lucien, disturbed by the loss of his blanket, made a sound. I know, she said. I owe you one. He subsided. She kept walking. The tree line reached her before she expected it. The road surface changed from packed dirt to something that crunched, frozen leaf litter, pine needles, the occasional stone that shifted and tried to tip her sideways. The forest swallowed the ambient light from the keep almost immediately. She stood in the dark for a moment, letting her eyes adjust, which they did, slowly, because she was an alpha's mate, and the blood in her was not human blood, whatever the council had decided about her status. She followed the edge of the tree line rather than going straight in. That was one instinct she trusted. Stay at the boundary until you know what you're walking toward. The eastern settlement Dael had mentioned was a loose scatter of buildings. She'd ridden past it twice in her first year at the keep, when Darian had taken her on the boundary surveys. She had a sense of the direction. She had no sense of the distance, and with 2 infants and bare feet in winter dark, distance was the variable that could kill her. She started cataloging what she had. The boys, alive, warm against her chest. The wool blankets for them, minus 1 layer she'd sacrificed for her feet. Milk for perhaps the next 8 hours. The letter in Kale's lining, the dress on her back. The knowledge that there was a man named Holt, who owed something to someone, and that the word Dael had used was owed. not owed in the past, which meant the debt was current. She started cataloging what she knew about the last 3 months, specifically about Seraphine Marin, specifically about how a woman with access to the palace's East Wing at 2 in the morning had also had access to the military dispatch schedules that went through the same corridor's communication room. She started cataloging names, the council members who had voted without speaking, the lords who had looked away, the guards who had kept their eyes straight ahead. She was building something. She didn't know yet what shape it would take. But she had been the daughter of a border lord before she was a Luna, and her father had taught her that the worst thing you could do to an enemy was let them think they'd finished you. The thought of her father was a blade she decided not to touch tonight. She tucked it away. Cale made a small sound, not distress, something more exploratory, and she shifted him against her shoulder and he settled. He was going to be a serious person, she could already tell. And Lucian was going to be something else, something she didn't have a word for yet, because he slept through things that should have woken him and then fixed her with a look when she least expected it, dark-eyed and measuring, that made her feel assessed. She loved them with a ferocity that scared her slightly, not because it was unfamiliar, she had known she would love them, but because it had edges. It was the kind of love that had physics to it, that created force. She had felt it the first time Darian held her hand in the northern courtyard in the second year of their match, and she had felt it the first time she understood he was not going to defend her tonight, and she felt it now in the dark at the edge of a forest she was about to walk into with no shoes and 2 infants and one piece of evidence that might not be enough. Love without force is sentiment. She was not interested in sentiment tonight. She walked. The Eastern settlement materialized after what her body told her was about 2 hours. A cluster of lights, low and orange, the kind of lights that come from lanterns in buildings where people are awake late, doing things they don't want observed. She smelled smoke before she saw the buildings. She smelled horses. She smelled food, something with fat in it, rendered, which made her realize she hadn't eaten since the morning of the tribunal, and the saliva in her mouth was suddenly embarrassing. She didn't approach the lights directly. She skirted them, taking the measure. 3 buildings visible. A lean-to with horses. She could hear them moving. A structure that was lit from the inside, sound coming from it, male voices. Not belligerent, just the sound of men who are awake at this hour and have accepted it. A 3rd building dark. She needed the horses more than she needed anything else. She needed a horse, and she needed 4 hours of shelter, and she needed something to eat, and she was going to get these things from a man named Holt using the information that he owed a debt to someone, which was the thinnest possible leverage, and she knew it. She went to the lit building, knocked on the frame because there was no door, just a hanging. The voices stopped. A man pulled the hanging aside. He was in his 50s, broad across the shoulders in a way that spoke to labor rather than ceremony, with a beard that had been trimmed recently and eyes that assessed her in one sweep. The babies, the makeshift foot wrappings, the dress, the baskets, and gave nothing away in return. "Holt," she said. Not a question. He looked at her another moment. "You'd be Rowan Ashcroft," he said. "I'd be Rowan Ashcroft," she agreed. "Heard there was a tribunal tonight." "There was." "Heard the outcome." "News travels," she said. He scratched the side of his face, which she recognized as the gesture of a man making a decision he's already made. "Who told you to come here?" "Dale." Something moved in his expression, a brief softening, quickly managed. "She's still at the keep?" "Wet nurse," Rowan said. "She'll be there until the boys she's feeding no longer need her, which, given that she's currently feeding mine in absentia, may be some time." She shifted Cale's weight. "I need a horse. I need whatever you have that's edible. And I need to be gone from here before the keep sends anyone to check that I've actually left the territory." "Will they send someone?" "They might. If Breton is thorough, which he usually is, if they trace Dale's recommendation of you back to her, they'll question her and she'll tell them the truth, and then they'll come here. I'd estimate you have until midday tomorrow." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not asking you to take a risk for nothing. Dale said you have a debt outstanding." Holt was quiet for a long moment. Behind him she could sense the shape of whoever else was in the room. 2 men, she thought, neither of them moving. "A horse and supplies," he said finally, "in exchange for that debt, cleared." "Cleared," she said. He studied her a moment longer. "You know where you're going?" "Not yet," she said honestly. He nodded once, as if that was actually the right answer. "Come inside. You look like you're about 30 minutes from frostbite, and your sons need warmth before they need a horse." She stepped through the hanging into the light. She ate standing because sitting felt dangerous. Felt like her body might decide to stop. Bread, which was hard, and a piece of cured meat she didn't identify and didn't ask about, and something hot in a clay cup that was some kind of broth. She ate one-handed because she could not put Kale down in an unfamiliar place. Not yet, so she held him against her chest and ate with the other hand, and Lucian slept on in his basket near the small fire that occupied one corner of the room. The two other men, young, 20s, brothers by the look of them, were polite in the specific way of people who have been instructed to be polite by someone they don't argue with. They didn't speak to her. They helped prepare the horse without being asked. While the horse was being readied, Holt stood in the doorway and looked at the direction of the keep. "Word of advice," he said, without turning around. "Keep it," Rowan said. He turned then, with a look of mild surprise. "I've had enough advice from men who mean well tonight," she said. "I'll figure out what I need without it." A long pause. Then something shifted in his face that might have been respect, if respect could be that unsentimental. "Fair," he said. The horse was a gray mare, older, steady rather than fast, which was actually what she needed, fast horses being for people who were confident they knew the right direction, and she was not yet that person. There were saddlebags with provisions, more than she had asked for. She noticed. She didn't comment. She mounted, difficult, with both boys, until Holt held Kale without being asked, and then handed him back up once she was seated, which she acknowledged with a nod. And she turned the mare east because east was away from the keep, and the territory boundary was 3 hours in that direction. And once she crossed it, she would be in unaffiliated land, and there were no more rules after that, only the ones she made herself. At the edge of the settlement, she stopped. She didn't know why. Something, the cold or the dark, or the specific arrangement of the stars above the ridge, made her stop and turn and look back at Voss Keep. She couldn't see it from here. The forest was between her and it, but she knew the direction, the way you always know the direction of a place where something was taken from you. She thought about Darian's face, the exact specific moment when he had looked at her across the courtyard, and she had read in his eyes not cruelty. She had expected cruelty. She could have worked with cruelty, but something emptier. Something like a man who has already made his decision and is now simply waiting for the geometry of events to catch up with it. She thought about the years she had spent learning his border routes, his council members, his enemies. She thought about the letters she had written on his behalf and the meetings she had sat through without speaking because he had wanted her present as a signal. The Luna at the table means this conversation is serious. And the ways she had translated his silences to other men, and the ways other men had underestimated her because they assumed the silence was hers. She thought, they have no idea what I know. And then she thought, they will. She faced east and rode. She was perhaps a mile into the forest, the mare's hooves soft on the pine needle floor, both boys quiet, the only sound the creak of saddle leather and her own breathing. When she realized that the sounds of the forest had changed, she pulled up. Behind her, perhaps 5 minutes back. Hooves. Not one horse. Multiple. Moving without torches, which meant either tracking by scent, alpha tracking, the kind that didn't need light, or moving at speed without caring about light because they knew the terrain. She counted the sounds. 4 horses. Maybe 5. Breton had been thorough after all. She looked at the darkness ahead of her. The territory boundary was still 2 hours out. The mare was steady but not fast, and she had 2 infants and whatever they'd packed in the saddlebags, and whoever was behind her had picked a night that was cold enough to slow everything down. Lucian woke up. She felt it before she heard it. The change in his breathing against her chest, the small animal alertness of a 13-day-old infant who had been disturbed. He made a sound. Not a cry. Sound. And then the horses behind her stopped. She felt something shift in the air, the way you feel a change in weather before you see it. Some pressure differential, some alteration in the quality of silence. It was not her imagination. She had grown up on a border and she knew the difference between a quiet forest and a forest that was being quiet. From somewhere behind her, obscured by trees and darkness, a voice called out. Not Breton's voice. Not any of the council guards she knew. Darian's voice. Rowan. Just her name. Carrying through the cold air with the particular resonance of an alpha who was not using his authority and was not using tenderness, and had arrived at some stripped-down frequency that was neither of those things. She sat on the mare in the dark with her sons against her chest, and she thought, do not let him see your face until you know what this is. She did not turn around. She did not turn around. That was the first decision, and it was the right one, and she knew it the way she knew which way was north in the dark. Not by thinking, but by something older than thought, something that lived in the place between her ribs where fear and clarity share the same square foot of space. Darian's voice had carried through the trees, and now the forest was doing what forests do, absorbing it, letting it settle into the cold air, offering nothing back. She sat on the gray mare and felt the boy's weight against her chest. Lucien alert now. Cale still watching whatever Cale watched in the dark behind his eyes. And she breathed through her nose and waited for him to speak again. He didn't, which told her something. A man who comes after the woman he's exiled, riding without torches through a winter forest at midnight, and then calls her name once and goes quiet. That man has not prepared what he intends to say. That man is operating on instinct, which meant he was scared, which meant somewhere in the architecture of what had just happened tonight, Darian Voss had found a crack. She filed that away and turned the mare around. There were 4 riders. Darian was at the front, 10 yards back, sitting his black horse the way he always sat. Spine straight, hands loose on the reins, the particular stillness of an alpha who had never once had to prove what he was by moving quickly. He had not dressed for the cold. He was still in the council clothes from the tribunal, which meant he had left the keep within minutes of the gate closing behind her. The other 3 riders she recognized. Personal guard. Not Breton's men. Darian's men, the ones who answered only to him. They held back. She noted that too. She stopped the mare 6 feet from him, close enough to see his face, far enough that she had made the distance a statement. For a moment, neither of them said anything. His eyes went to the boys first. She watched him do it, watched the involuntary drop of his gaze to Cale and Lucien, watched the muscle in his jaw work once and then go still. Whatever he felt in that moment, she didn't know and wasn't going to guess. She had spent 3 years interpreting his silences, and she was done with that particular craft. "You're not dressed for this weather," he said. "No," she agreed. "I'm not." Another silence. One of the horses behind him shifted, and someone steadied it. "Where are you going?" he said. "You exiled me," she said. "You don't get to know." He looked at her. The cold had put color in his face, high on the cheeks, and his breath was visible, slow and even. Controlled. He was working to be controlled. She could see the work. "Rowan." His voice dropped. Not authority, not gentleness. That stripped frequency again. "I need you to listen to me." "I listened to you tonight," she said. "For 3 hours I stood in that courtyard and I listened to you say nothing. I've heard everything you have to say." The council, "Don't." The word came out flat, not hot. She had moved past hot somewhere around the 2nd hour in the cell. "Don't tell me about the council. You are the Alpha King. The council advises. You decide. I know how it works. I've watched you make 17 decisions in that courtroom that went against your council's recommendation. 17. I kept count because I thought it mattered, because I thought you were a man who made his own choices." She felt her jaw tighten and released it deliberately. "Tonight was the 18th decision. You made that one too." He absorbed it without flinching, which was the thing about Darian that had always cut her. He didn't flinch. He just took it in and became more still, like a man adding weight to something already heavy. "The letter," he said. "Seraphine's letter. I didn't see it until after you decided. After the tribunal concluded." He stopped, started again. "Breton told me it was a forgery." "Breton would," she said. "He had a handwriting expert. Breton has everything. She looked at him steadily. That's who Breton is. He has everything he needs to be believed, and he has had months to prepare it, which I know because I spent those same months watching him prepare it and bringing you what I found and watching you weigh my word against his and find mine lighter. She paused. That wasn't tonight. That was 8 months ago. The tribunal was just the paperwork. Something moved in his face. She didn't soften toward it. She had was learning right now on this horse, in this cold, that the impulse to soften toward the pain of someone who has hurt you is not kindness. It is the oldest trap. It looks like empathy, and it functions like a lock on a door you need to leave through. Cale and Lucien, he said. His voice had changed, lower, something raw in it that he wasn't bothering to manage. I want to know they're safe. They're on this horse, she said, with me, which is where they'll stay. I'm not trying to take them. I know, you already decided not to take them. That was in Breton's script, and you let it be. She watched his face. Did you know it would hurt me more? To keep them, or to send them with me? He didn't answer. Because I think you did, she said. I think some part of you knew that sending them with me was the thing that would actually break me, because it meant I'd spend the rest of my life with everything I love most and no ability to protect it, rather than losing them clean and having nothing left to lose. I think you know how my mind works that well. She shifted Cale's weight. The question I've been sitting with is whether that was cruelty or whether you just understood me and decided it was enough. The silence between them had gone from cold to something else, something pressurized. I'm going to fix this, he said. She looked at him. I am going to fix this, he said again, and there was something in his voice that she recognized. The quality he got when he had decided something, the particular density of a decision that had already become a fact in his mind. She had loved that quality. She had loved the way certainty lived in him like a physical material. You can't, she said. Rowan, you can't fix exile by uncalling it in a forest at midnight. There are 47 Alpha Lords who witnessed that tribunal. There are council records. There is a kingdom that watched its Luna be stripped of title and walked out the gate. She shook her head. What you can do now, what is still in your power tonight, is let me ride east. That's it. That's the only thing left that you can give me. He sat very still for a long moment. The cold moved between them. If I let you go tonight, he said carefully, I can't protect you. You didn't protect me tonight. Outside the territory, there are packs that would... I know what's outside the territory, she said. I studied your maps. I know every allied pack, every neutral territory, every disputed border. I know it because you asked me to learn it when you were managing the Western expansion, and you needed someone you could talk to who understood the geography. She felt something tighten in her chest that was not grief and not anger, but some compound of both that didn't have a name. I have been useful to you for 3 years. Tonight, I just stopped being useful in the way you needed, so I became a problem instead. His jaw worked. That is not what... I'm not asking you to agree with me, she said. I'm telling you what is true. You can disagree with it from your keep while I'm riding east. It won't change it. He looked at her for a long time. Long enough that one of the horses behind him shifted again, and the movement broke something in the tension. There's a pack east of the Greywater boundary, he said. His voice had flattened out. He was giving her information. She understood the shift. He had moved from argument to something else, something that was the closest he could get to what she had once known him to be. Vane's territory. He runs neutral. Doesn't owe me alliance. Doesn't owe my enemies. He has a settlement. Medical resources. He stopped. He's fair. She stored the name. Vane. Greywater boundary. Why are you telling me this? She said. Because I can't go with you, he said, and I can't bring you back tonight, and you're in a white dress with no boots in the coldest week of the year with 2 infants. His voice had roughed up. She heard it and chose not to respond to it. I'm telling you this because it's what I have. It's the one thing I can do from here. She looked at him. At this man she had slept beside for 3 years, whose voice she had learned in the dark, whose silences she had translated into policy, and whose certainty she had leaned against like a wall that had turned out to be painted on. All right, she said. Something shifted in his face, hope, or the beginning of it. She shut it down before it could complete. "I'll note it," she said. "I won't forget that you told me, but it doesn't change what tonight was." She gathered the reins. "Don't follow me past this point." "Rowan, don't." Not loud, just final. "Your sons are warm and fed and with their mother. That's the only thing you should be thinking about right now. That's your one piece of peace tonight. Don't trade it." She turned the mare east. She listened for hooves behind her, for the sound of him deciding differently, for the crack of frozen ground that would tell her he'd moved. Nothing. She rode. The Greywater boundary took her the rest of the night and half the next morning. She stopped twice, once to feed the boys using the prepared milk Dale had packed, crouched under a pine with the mare tethered nearby, and her own hunger something she acknowledged and set aside. Once to let the mare drink from a creek that was mostly frozen, but had a channel of moving water at its center that she found by following the sound. She thought about Darian's voice. She thought about the name Vane, which she turned over in her mind, examining its edges. She thought about Breton's handwriting expert, and the fact that Breton had had months, and she had to wonder who else in the keep had been part of the preparation, who had watched her walk into rooms and smiled and carried information back. She was building a list. She had no paper and no ink, so she was building it in her head, the way her father had taught her to remember things that mattered. Assign each piece a position in a familiar space, a room you know, a route you walk. She put names in hallways of the palace she would probably never see again. She put dates in doorways. She would not forget any of it. The Greywater was a river rather than a boundary marker. A dark, fast-moving thing that had cut down through limestone and moved with the particular authority of water that has been moving for a long time. She found the crossing Darian had described. There was a crossing, which meant he had given her more specific information than she'd realized in the moment, which meant he had been planning what to say before he called her name. She filed that too. Vane's settlement sat on the eastern bank about a mile south of the crossing. She smelled it before she saw it. Wood smoke, animals, cooked grain, the compound smell of a working community that had been in one place long enough to have accumulated a particular scent. She came in from the tree line in full daylight, which she had timed, because coming out of trees in the dark carrying 2 infants was the kind of thing that got people shot first. A woman met her at the edge of the settlement. Mid-30s, dark-skinned, with the kind of build that comes from actual physical work, and the kind of face that assesses fast and gives nothing back immediately. She was carrying a short blade at her hip in a working leather sheath, not ceremonial, not decorative. She looked at the horse, the babies, the dress, the improvised foot wrappings. Then she looked at Rowan's face. "You're from the kingdom," she said. "I was," Rowan said. The woman's eyes moved once toward the tree line Rowan had come out of, checking. "Anyone following you?" "Not as of 6 hours ago." A pause. "That's not the same as no." "No," Rowan agreed. "It's not." The woman looked at the boys again. "How old?" 13 days. Something shifted in the woman's expression, just briefly, a recalibration. She turned and said, without raising her voice, "Marin, water and food at the East House." Then she looked back at Rowan. "Get down. I'll take the horse." "I'll manage the horse," Rowan said. The woman met her eyes, a long beat of 2 people reading each other, then a single nod. "East House is the one with the gray door. I'll be there in 10 minutes. Her name, Rowan learned, was Sura. She had been Vane's second in command for 9 years, which meant she ran the settlement on a daily basis while Vane managed territory politics, which meant she was the person who actually mattered here. She sat across from Rowan in the East House while Rowan ate. Real food, hot, something with root vegetables and actual salt. With Kale and Lucien settled in a wooden crate someone had lined with a horse blanket and positioned near the fire. Sura had not asked their names. She had not asked what happened. She had provided food and warmth and then sat down and waited, which was a particular kind of intelligence that Rowan recognized and respected. "I need shelter," Rowan said. "A few weeks. I'll work for it. I can do whatever you need. Administration, records, negotiation, medicine, if you have a supply problem, translation if you have territory contacts who speak the Highland dialect." She looked at Sura steadily. "I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for a transaction." Sura turned her cup in her hands. And after a few weeks? I don't know yet, Rowan said. I need time to figure out what's next. Where you came from, Sura said carefully. That's Voss territory. It was. And you're not... Sura stopped, started again. There won't be men coming here looking for you, with a Voss seal. No, Rowan said. The exile is legal. They don't want me back. They want me gone, which is different. She paused. I won't bring trouble here. If I believed I wouldn't have come. Sura studied her face for a long moment. Whatever she was measuring, she seemed to find an adequate amount of it. 2 weeks, she said. After that, we discussed terms. 2 weeks, Rowan said. She slept for 4 hours that afternoon, which was all she allowed herself, with Lucien curled against her side and Cale in the crate, where she could see him from the pallet. When she woke, the light had shifted and she lay still for a moment looking at the ceiling of the east house, which was rough timber and had a water stain in one corner shaped like a reaching hand. She thought, Darian is waking up right now in the keep. Seraphine is at breakfast. Breton is reviewing his next move, and she thought, none of them know what I know. None of them know what I remember. None of them know that I spent 3 years learning everything they used that courtyard to strip from me, and that the thing about knowledge is that it stays where it is when everything else gets taken. She sat up. Lucien made a small sound and resettled. She looked at her sons, both of them, asleep in their improvised warmth, and she felt the love that had edges, the love with physics, move through her chest. She had 2 weeks. She would use every minute of them. She was 3 days into those 2 weeks, had already organized Sura's supply records and identified 2 errors in the territory boundary agreements that had been costing the settlement grain tithe for 7 years, and was beginning to understand the shape of what she was building here. When the scout came in from the western tree line, with his hand pressed to his side and blood running through his fingers, carrying a message that had clearly been meant to arrive by less violent means. The message was for her. It was written in a hand she didn't recognize, on paper that bore no seal. It said, Breton knows you have the letter. He is sending someone who is not a guard. Leave now. Rowan read it twice. Then she looked up at Sura, who had come in behind the scout and was watching her face. How bad? Sura said, meaning the scout. The message, Rowan said, or whatever got to him before the message did? Both. Rowan set the paper down on the supply table. Bad enough, she said. And then, because the 2 weeks were over now, whether she wanted them to be or not, and because the things she had been doing in the East House, building, cataloging, planning, surviving, had just become something else, something with motion and direction, and a destination she hadn't known until this moment. I need to tell you what I know, all of it, and I need you to help me decide what to do with it. Sura looked at her for a moment. Then she pulled up a chair. Start talking, she said. Sura listened without interrupting. That was the first thing Rowan noticed. The quality of her silence was not passive, it was active, the silence of someone who understood that speaking too soon was a form of theft. Rowan told her everything. The 8 months of watching Breton build his case, the dispatch schedules and how Seraphine had access to the East Corridor communication room because Darian had given her a suite that shared a wall with it, a detail that looked like hospitality and functioned like a key. The 47 dead at Crestwall, and how the mobilization delay that killed them had originated not from Rowan's interference, but from a counterorder issued under a forged signature. A forgery she had identified 3 days after the battle and brought to Darian, who had brought it to Breton, who had told him the handwriting analysis was inconclusive. She told Sura about the letter in Kyle's blanket lining. She took it out and laid it flat on the supply table, smoothing the creases with the side of her hand. Sura leaned forward and read it without touching it. That's enough to reopen the tribunal, Sura said. It's enough to ask for one, Rowan said. It's not enough to win one. Seraphine will say it's forged. Breton will produce another handwriting expert. And I'll be a convicted exile with no title and no standing in a kingdom that already officially decided my guilt. She looked at the letter. What I need is corroboration. Someone inside the palace who was present for conversations that aren't in any official record. And the message tonight, Sura said, meaning the bloodied scout, meaning Breton knows you have the letter. Someone in the keep has been watching, Rowan said. Someone who sent that warning, which means someone who wants Breton stopped and is using me as the instrument because they can't act directly. She sat back. I don't know who. I don't know their angle. And I have an unknown number of hours before whoever Breton sent arrives here. Sura looked at the letter for another moment. Then she stood. I'll get Vane. Vane was a large man, quiet in the way that large men sometimes are when they have never needed volume to establish their presence. He had a gray streak in his dark hair that ran from his left temple back, and he listened to Rowan the way Sura had, completely, without performance. When she finished, he looked at the letter and then at her face and said, "What do you need from me?" Not what can I do. What do you need? The distinction mattered. A direction, she said. You've managed neutral territory for how long? 14 years. Then you know every pack that operates outside Voss's alliance structure. I need to know which ones have grievances with Breton specifically. Not with Darien, with Breton. Breton has been the kingdom's primary negotiator on territory disputes for 6 years. In 6 years of negotiations, he will have made enemies that aren't Darien's enemies. Vane studied her. You're not just running, he said. I was never just running, she said. He nodded once, slowly. There's a woman named Alva. She runs the Ashfin Coalition. 3 small packs, Eastern Basin, been in a land dispute with Voss over the mineral rights on the lower ridge for 4 years. Breton personally blocked their last 3 petitions. He paused. She's not a friend of mine, but she's not an enemy either. Can you get a message to her? I can get a message to her by morning. Do it, Rowan said. Tell her I have documentation of Breton's methods, and I'm willing to share information in exchange for shelter and passage when I need it. Vane looked at Sura. Something passed between them. Not doubt, a kind of shared acknowledgement of weight. You understand what you're starting, Sura said. Rowan thought about the courtyard. The white dress, Darien's hands resting on the chair arms, looking somewhere to the left of her. 13 days old and already learning what the cold felt like. I understand what was already started, she said. I'm just deciding to be present for it. She moved that night. Vane provided a different horse, faster, younger, better suited for what was coming, and Sura packed saddlebags with more forethought than Holt had managed, including a short blade in a sheath that she handed to Rowan without comment, and Rowan accepted the same way. A woman in the settlement named Petra, who had the wide hands and steady eyes of someone who had raised children through hard winters, agreed to travel with Rowan as second set of hands for the boys. Not escort, not guard. Practical support offered as an exchange for passage east, where Petra had family. They rode through the dark. Rowan held the boys against her chest and felt the horse moving under her and thought about the message, the handwriting, the paper, the fact that someone inside Voss Keep had known she had the letter and had cared enough about that knowledge to send a warning at cost to a scout's body. There were only a handful of people who knew about the letter. Dael, who had not known specifically what was hidden in the blanket lining, but who had packed that blanket. Rowan herself. And Darien. She turned that over in her mind the way you turn a stone over looking for what lives under it. She did not arrive at a conclusion. She stored the question and rode. The next 3 weeks happened fast and slow the way significant time always does. Compressed in memory, endless in the living. Alva's response to Vane's message came within 2 days. Cautious, brief, specific. She wanted to meet. She named a location and a time, and she named them alone, which told Rowan that Alva was either very confident or very afraid, and the tone of the message suggested the former. The meeting happened in a stone building at the edge of Ashfin territory that smelled of damp and old metal. Alva was 60 years old and built like a woman who had been carved from the landscape she managed, compact, weathered, with eyes that had been narrowed by years of watching distant things. She looked at Rowan across the table and said nothing for long enough that most people would have filled the silence. Rowan didn't fill it. You have Seraphine's letter, Alva said finally. I do. And you want to use it. I want to use everything I have, Rowan said. The letter is one piece. Alva looked at her steadily. What are you building? I don't know yet, Rowan said. I know the foundation. I know some of the materials. I'm still learning the site. That answer seemed to satisfy something in Alva that a more polished answer wouldn't have. She leaned back. I have 3 witnesses to a meeting that occurred 2 years ago. A meeting between Breton and a land surveyor named Oris, in which Breton instructed Oris to falsify the Eastern Ridge boundary markers. Those markers are the basis of the mineral rights dispute. She paused. I've been sitting on those witnesses because I had no path, no standing, no channel that doesn't run directly through the kingdom's court system, which Breton controls. I'm a channel, Rowan said. You're an exile, Alva said. Not cruel. Precise. I'm an exile with standing that no legal document can erase, Rowan said. I am the mother of Darian Voss's sons. Those boys carry sovereign alpha blood. Whatever Breton's tribunal decided about my title, it cannot decide what runs in my son's veins or what claim that blood makes on the kingdom's future. She held Alva's gaze. When the time comes, and it will come, I don't know when, but it will, I will need witnesses who can speak to Breton's methods in documented form, and you need someone who can bring your case to a court that hasn't been compromised. She spread her hands on the table. I'm offering you a future conversation. Not now. Not soon. But a real one. Alva studied her for a long time. Long enough that the silence became something they were both sitting inside of, examining from opposite sides. My witnesses will be documented, Alva said finally. Signed, sealed with my mark. I'll hold them until you ask for them. That's all I'm asking for tonight, Rowan said. She was building. Every week she understood the structure better. Alva was the Eastern Foundation. The message from inside the keep was a thread she was still pulling. Vane was neutral ground and Sura was logistics, and Petra had turned out to be more than practical help. She had a brother in the Highland Pax who had his own relationship with Voss Kingdom grievances, and his name connected to 2 other names, and those names connected to a supply route that Breton had manipulated to run through a company he held a hidden interest in, which was financial corruption layered under the political kind. Rowan stored every piece. She wrote nothing down. Paper was too vulnerable, and instead she used the method her father had taught her, placing names and dates and facts in the rooms of a palace she was building in her mind. A palace that had no physical address, that existed only in the space between her temples, that could not be raided. The boys grew. That was the thing that kept breaking her open in the hours between, not grief, something more complicated than grief. Cale at 4 weeks was already holding his own head up longer than he should have been able to, watching things with that focused, dark-eyed attention. Lucien had developed a specific sound he made when he was working something out in whatever passed for cognition at that age. A low, concentrated murmur, almost conversational. She talked to them while she rode. She told them the names she was collecting. She told them the logic of what she was building. They couldn't understand a word of it, and that was not the point. The point was that she was not going to raise sons who inherited a world that had been explained to them. She was going to raise sons who learned the structure of things from the beginning, who understood that power was not given but built, piece by piece, in the dark, by people who refused to stop when stopping would have been the reasonable choice. 6 weeks after the exile, Petra's brother brought her information she hadn't asked for and hadn't expected. His name was Colt, and he arrived in the early evening, trail-worn, with the careful manner of a man delivering something he wasn't sure would be welcome. He sat across from Rowan in the small room that had become her workspace in the second settlement she'd moved to, further east, smaller, less connected to anything Breton might trace, and he put a folded piece of paper on the table. This came through the Highland route, he said, through 3 hands. Someone wanted it to reach you without a direct line. She opened it. It was written in a hand she knew. Not Darian's hand. She would have recognized that and felt a specific thing about it that she didn't want to feel. This was Torrin's hand. The guard who had walked her morning routes. The guard who had kept his eyes straight ahead on the tower stairs because he hadn't wanted her to see his face. The letter was short. It said, Breton has moved against the Eastern Lords. 2 council members have been removed on corruption charges that originated from Breton's office. The Lords are afraid. Darian does not know the full scope. I cannot speak from inside, But there is a man named Pell, former court recorder, discharged 8 months ago without stated cause, who was present for the Crestwall order. He knows what the counter order said and who dictated it. He is currently in the river settlement at Kyle's Ford. He will not come forward without protection. He will not trust a messenger. He needs to hear your voice. Rowan read it twice. Then she set it down. She thought, Torrin has been watching for 6 weeks. Torrin sent the first warning about Breton and the letter. Torrin is the thread she had been pulling, and it had led here to a name, Pell, and a location, and a piece of evidence that was not documentary but testimonial, which was different, which was in some ways stronger because it could not be called a forgery. The counter order. The order that had actually caused the Crestwall delay. If Pell had been in the room when it was dictated, if Pell had recorded it and been discharged specifically to silence him, then everything Breton had built the tribunal on was not just false. It was constructed on top of something that could be proven false, which was different from being believed and different from winning a legal argument and much, much more dangerous to the people who had built it. She looked at Colt. How far is Kyle's Ford? 4 days hard riding, he said. 2.5 if you push. I'll push, she said. She was already standing, already calculating. Petra for the boys. Sura notified. Vane's route through the neutral corridor to avoid the Voss border patrols that had started appearing in the eastern territories with an increase in frequency that told her Breton's search had widened. There's something else, Colt said. She stopped. His face had gone careful. The kind of careful that meant the something else was the actual point of the visit, and everything prior had been approach. The border patrols, he said. The ones that have been pushing east. I've noticed them. 2 days ago, one of them stopped a traveling family, Highland people, neutral, no connection to anything. Searched their wagon. He paused. They were looking for 2 infants, specific description. Twin boys, dark-eyed, alpha blood indicators. The room went very still. Breton's orders, he said. Not Darian's. There's a distinction being made according to what I heard, but I don't know how long that distinction holds. Rowan stood in the quiet and felt the information land in her body the way physical blows land. First the impact, then the understanding of what was broken. They were not looking for her. They were looking for her sons. Breton had decided that exile was insufficient, or he had always intended this and had simply waited until she was isolated enough that acting on it would be easier. Or, and this was the thought that carried the most weight, that she could feel pressing against the back of her teeth. He had realized what she was building, that the letter was only the visible part of it, that she had been moving and connecting and compiling for 6 weeks, and that someone in his network had noticed. He was not trying to bring her back. He was trying to remove the one leverage she had that could not be forged, could not be countered with a handwriting expert, could not be legally dismissed. Her sons were the blood claim on the kingdom's future. Without them, she was an exiled woman with a letter and some witnesses. With them, she was a threat that compounded with every week they grew stronger. She stood in the room and she thought about who she had been 8 weeks ago. The woman in the white dress in the courtyard, counting her breaths like ammunition, believing that exile was the worst of it. She had been wrong about that. And she understood now, in the particular cold clarity of a moment when everything you have built is suddenly at risk, that the woman who had stood in that courtyard had survived by enduring, by patience, by cataloging and connecting and waiting for the structure to reveal itself. That woman was not going to be enough for what was coming. The thing she had been resisting, the full, unqualified acknowledgement that this was not a legal problem or a political problem, but a war, that she was not a witness to it, or a victim of it, or a builder working quietly at its edges, but a combatant, and that combatants did not win by accumulating evidence in rooms, settled into her chest like something that had always been waiting there. She looked at Colt. "Get me to Kyle's Ford," she said, "and then I need you to take a message back through the Highland route, not to Torrin, directly to the Eastern Lords Breton has moved against." She held his gaze. "Tell them I have what they need to stop him. Tell them I'm ready to move. And tell them that the woman asking is not asking for their mercy. She's offering them a chance to be on the right side of what happens next." Colt looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. She walked to where Cale and Lucien lay sleeping and stood over them in the low light. Cale's hand was curled open at his cheek. Lucien was doing the murmuring thing even in sleep, that private internal conversation. She looked at them and felt the love with edges move through her like current through a wire. She had built something in 6 weeks. Breton had just told her it wasn't enough. And the terrible thing, the thing she stood in the low light understanding with the complete and irreversible clarity of a woman who has just run out of the option to be anything other than what the situation requires, was that he was right. She was going to have to become something she had not planned to become. And she was going to have to do it before he reached her sons. Kael's Ford was a river settlement built on the logic of necessity rather than comfort. Low buildings pressed against each other for warmth. Streets that were really just the spaces between structures. A population that had learned to keep their eyes on their own work and ask nothing about the work of others. Rowan arrived in the gray hour before full dawn with Colt ahead of her and the short blade at her hip and her sons in Petra's arms a half-mile back, in a dry barn on the settlement's edge, because she was not bringing them any closer to a man whose safety she couldn't verify. She found Pell in the third building they checked. A back room, low ceiling, a single window that faced the wall of the building next door. He was perhaps 50, thin in the way of a man who had been eating adequately until recently and was now not, with ink-stained fingers and the careful hunched posture of someone who had spent decades bent over a writing desk and was now bent over something else. Fear, probably. Extended, unrelenting fear. He looked up when she came in and she saw his face go through several things in rapid sequence. Recognition, calculation, something that might have been relief and might have been its opposite. "You're smaller than I expected," he said. "You're alive," she said, "which is what matters. Torn said you'd need to hear my voice. Torn said you'd come yourself." He looked at the door behind her, then at her face. No guards. No guards. He sat back. His hands were clasped on the table in front of him, and she could see the effort it took to keep them still. "They discharged me 8 months ago. No stated cause, no severance, no formal record. I walked out of the palace with my pen case and the clothes I was wearing." He stopped. "I kept my notes." She went very still. "Your court notes." Personal shorthand, habit of 30 years. I kept a parallel record, unofficial, in a cipher I developed myself. The council never knew. Breton never knew. His jaw tightened. "I kept them because I am a meticulous man, and a meticulous man does not discard his records. I did not keep them because I anticipated needing them. I want that understood." "Understood," she said. "The counter order." He looked at the table. "The one that delayed the Crestwall mobilization. I was present when it was composed. I was the one who wrote it out for the signature because Breton said the official recorder was unavailable and he needed a clean hand quickly." He paused. "I wrote what I was told to write. I didn't understand what it was for until afterward. By then I was already in the discharge process." "Who signed it?" she said. "It went out under a forged signature," he said. "Your name." She had known this. She had known the architecture of it for months. But hearing it stated plainly in a small room by a man who had held a pen while it happened, something tightened in her chest that was not grief and was not anger. Was something older, the sensation of a mechanism clicking into place that had been assembled in the dark. "And in your notes," she said, "the composition of that order, the date, Breton's presence." "All of it," he said, "in my cipher, which I can translate." He looked at her. "I want protection. My family. My daughter is in the northern settlement. She has 2 children. I want them moved somewhere Breton cannot reach before I give you anything." "Tell me where they are," she said. "I have a network. It's not large, but it reaches the northern settlement. Give me 2 days." He studied her face. The assessment of a careful man measuring the distance between what he needed to believe and what the evidence actually supported. 2 days, he said. She moved his daughter and her children in 36 hours. The network she had built, Alva's people in the east, Colt's Highland contacts, Vane's neutral corridor, turned out to be precisely adequate for the task of moving 3 people quietly, which told her something about the difference between a network assembled for an abstract future and one that had just been tested on a specific present. Pell translated his notes on the second morning. She sat across from him and read what emerged, the dates, the wording, the notation of who was in the room, and she added it to the palace in her mind, placed it in the central hall where the most important things lived, and felt the structure of what she was building become, for the first time, load-bearing. She had the letter. She had Alva's witnesses on the boundary fraud. She had Pell's translated notes on the Crestwall counter-order. She had Torin inside the keep, who had been watching for weeks, and who had just demonstrated that he could move information through the Highland route reliably. What she did not have was a way to bring it into the kingdom's court system without standing, without title, without the legal right to petition. She was working that problem on the third morning when Colt came in from the settlement's perimeter with mud on his boots and his face arranged in a way that told her before he spoke that the calculation had just changed. Border Patrol, he said, not Voss Colors, Breton's private company, the ones he's been using in the Eastern Territories. How many? 8 riders. They're at the settlement's north entrance. They're not searching yet. They're asking questions. 8 riders was not a search party. 8 riders was an extraction team, which meant someone in her network had given Breton a location, or Breton's people had followed a thread she hadn't cut cleanly, or, and this was the possibility that made the back of her neck cold, the Highland route was not as secure as she had believed, and the messages she'd been sending through it had been partially visible. She looked at Pell. "Can you ride?" "Not well," he said. "Better than walking in winter." She was already on her feet. "Colt, get Petra and the boys south on the river track. Not the road, the track. Move now. Don't wait for me." "Where are you going?" Colt said. She had the blade at her hip. She had Pell's translated notes folded inside her jacket against her ribs, and the letter in its same position it had occupied since the night of the exile, sewn into a layer of cloth she wore against her skin. "I'm going to do the one thing I've been building toward for 6 weeks," she said, "which is create a situation where Breton has to respond publicly." She looked at Colt's face, which was trying to remain neutral and not managing it entirely. "I need you to trust me." "I trust you fine," he said. "I'm questioning the math." "The math works if the Eastern Lords move when I contact them," she said. "Alva confirmed they're ready. They've been waiting for a trigger. 8 of Breton's private company in a neutral settlement, searching for an exiled Luna and her Alpha Blood sons. That's a trigger. That's Breton operating outside kingdom law in territory that isn't his, and every lord east of the Greywater will see it." She sent 3 messages through the fastest available channels before she left the building. 1 to Alva, 1 through Torin's Highland route to Torin himself, 3 words, "Move on Darien," and 1 to Vane, telling him to open his territory as neutral ground for whatever came next. Then she went north. The 8 riders were at the settlement entrance interviewing a grain merchant who was doing his considerable best to know nothing. They were wearing the kind of leather that was almost military, and not quite, a deliberate ambiguity that gave them deniability in neutral territory. The man at their front had the face of someone who had been hired for the quality of his indifference to outcomes. Rowan walked out of the alley to the settlement's main track and stopped 20 feet from them and waited. The lead rider saw her, looked again with the particular attention of a man checking a description against a reality. "Rowan Ashcroft," he said. "That's right," she said. He moved his horse forward, slow, the way you move towards something when you're not sure if it's going to run. "You'll come with us." "I will not," she said. He stopped. The 7 behind him had arranged themselves in a loose spread that was meant to look casual and was not. She counted their spacing. She noted who was watching her hands and who was watching her face. The ones watching her hands were the experienced ones. "Breton sent you," she said, loud enough for the grain merchant and the 2 other people who had materialized in doorways to hear clearly. "Breton Voss, High Counselor of the Voss Kingdom, sent 8 armed men into neutral Vane territory to retrieve an exiled woman and her 13-week-old sons. I want to make sure everyone present understands that clearly. This is not a kingdom action. There is no crown seal on any of you. This is a private action by a private man who is afraid of what I know." The lead rider's expression didn't change, which told her he'd been briefed on the possibility of this. "You'll come with us." "What will you do if I don't?" she said. A pause. And in the pause she heard something she had been listening for. Hooves. Not from the north. From the east. Alva's people had moved faster than she'd calculated, which meant the message had gone out before she'd sent it, which meant Alva had been watching the border patrol movements herself and had been waiting for exactly this kind of moment. The eastern riders came in from the tree line at a pace that was not quite urgent and was not quite relaxed. The pace of people arriving with purpose. There were 14 of them. They stopped at the settlement's eastern edge, and their lead rider, a woman Rowan had met once briefly in the stone building at Ashfin Territory's edge, looked at the 8 private company men with the expression of someone who has been expecting company and is unsurprised by their manners. "This is Vane territory," the eastern lead said. Her name was Fennec, and she had a voice that carried without effort. "I count 8 of Breton's private company operating without territorial sanction or kingdom seal. Someone want to explain that?" The lead rider looked between Rowan and Fennec and did the math. His math was the same math she'd been working for 6 weeks, which was that numbers and documentation together were heavier than either alone. He pulled his horse back 2 steps. "We'll be going," he said. "You will," Rowan agreed. "And when you get back to Breton, tell him that everything he's been trying to prevent is already in motion. Tell him the Eastern Lords have the documentation. Tell him Pell is going to testify." She held his gaze. "And tell him I'm coming home." They left. She watched them go, and then she breathed for the first time in what felt like an hour. A long, controlled exhale that she let out through her teeth. Fennec rode forward, looked at her with the appraising directness that seemed to be a characteristic of every competent woman who operated in neutral territory. "Alva said you'd need an escort." "I need a lot of things," Rowan said. "An escort is useful. What I actually need is a path into the kingdom that doesn't go through a border checkpoint." "I know too," Fennec said. "Show me one." The path through the Highland Pass took 3 days in weather that was cold, but no longer actively hostile. Late winter breaking reluctantly into something that was not yet spring, but had stopped pretending it would be winter forever. She rode with Petra and the boys ahead of her, and Fennec's 6-rider escort spread around them, and Pell, who rode badly but persistently, on a placid, borrowed horse at the group's rear. She spent the 3 days preparing. Not in the sense of strategizing. The strategy was set. She spent them preparing herself, which was different. She had been in exile for nearly 3 months, and in that time she had built and been tested and had discovered things about what she was capable of when stripped down to the elements. Now she was riding back toward the thing that had stripped her, and she needed to be clear about who was making that ride. Not the Luna who had stood in the white dress counting breaths, not the woman who had looked at Darian across the courtyard and read in his eyes the decision he had already made. Those were true pieces of her, both of them, but they were not the whole architecture. What she had learned in 3 months in the cold was that she had always known more than she had been permitted to use. That the skills she had applied on Darian's behalf, the maps, the negotiations, the letters, the translations, the ability to read a council room like a text and identify every subtext, had been assets she had loaned to someone else's purpose. She was not angry about that. Anger was expensive, and she was working with a limited supply of expensive things. She was simply clear about it now, in a way she had not been before. She was not going back to return to what she'd had. She was going back to finish what Breton had started, the full exposure of every layer of it, because it was the right action, and because her sons deserved a kingdom that had been cleaned of the rot that had festered in its walls, and because she had spent 3 months building something and she intended to use it. She was not going back for Darian. She told herself this with the precision of a woman who has stopped allowing herself comfortable approximations. On the 3rd morning, Torin met them at the Highland Pass entry. He came alone, which either meant he was confident in the timing or had made a decision about risk that she would ask him about later. He was in plain clothes, not guard colors. He looked tired in the specific way of someone who has been doing 2 jobs simultaneously for 3 months without being able to explain either to the other. He looked at her for a moment, then at the boys in Petra's arms. "They've grown," he said. "Children do that," she said. He almost smiled. "Darian received your message," he said, which meant the 3 words, "Move on, Darian," had arrived and been acted on. "He's dismissed Breton from the council chamber. Temporarily, officially pending an audit, which is the legal mechanism that lets him act without triggering the full council vote. Breton will challenge the audit, she said. Already has, which is why the timing matters. He looked at her steadily. You need to be inside the kingdom walls before he gets the challenge into formal documentation. Once it's in the record, Darian's hands are partially tied. How long do we have? Hours, he said. Maybe less. She looked at the pass ahead of her, at the sky above the ridge, which was the particular gray of early morning moving towards something better. At her sons, who were both awake, both watching the world with the unnerving attention they had been watching it with since their first hours alive. Then we move, she said. The border checkpoint was unmanned. Torin had arranged this, she didn't ask how, and they passed through the Voss territory boundary in the kind of quiet that felt like held breath. The landscape on the kingdom's side was familiar in the way that places where significant things happened become familiar, etched rather than just seen, carved into some layer below ordinary memory. She had last looked at this landscape from the other direction, in the dark, on a gray mare, with makeshift cloth wrapped around her feet. 3 months. The road to the keep was 4 hours at a steady pace. They made it in 3, pushing, and the keep materialized in the early afternoon light with all its cold stone and its banners and its absolute certainty in its own permanence. She had always thought the keep looked like authority made physical. Now she thought it looked like something that needed to be entered with a specific purpose and would resist anyone who came to it without one. They were met at the outer gate. Not Breton's men, not the council guard. Darian's personal guard, the same 4 who had ridden with him into the forest 3 months ago, and they opened the gate without a word and kept their eyes forward. He was in the outer courtyard, standing, not seated, not in the council chair, not positioned as the performance of authority, but simply present. In working clothes, the first time in 3 years she had seen him outside the formal costuming of the Alpha King. He looked older. She noted it the way she noted everything now, filed it, did not let it move her. His eyes went to the boys first, the same involuntary drop, the same movement in the jaw. Then to her face. She stopped 10 feet from him. The courtyard had other people in it, guards at their posts, 2 council members she recognized standing near the far wall, with the careful stillness of men waiting to see which direction the wind was blowing. She noted them. She noted that Breton was not among them. "Where is he?" she said. "Council records room," Darian said. His voice was even. "He's been there since this morning, trying to get documentation in order before I arrive," she said. "Yes." She looked at him for a moment. There was something in his face she hadn't expected to see. Not guilt. She had expected guilt. She had prepared for guilt and knew how to navigate around it. Something more like the expression of a man standing in the aftermath of something he caused and is not looking away from the damage. That was different from guilt. It was harder to dismiss. She dismissed it anyway. There would be time for whatever that was or wasn't. Not now. "I need access to the council chamber," she said. "I need Pell admitted to give testimony. I need Alva's documentation presented in formal record. And I need Breton in the room before he finishes whatever he's trying to bury in that records room." Darian looked at her for a long beat. The same stripped frequency she had heard in the forest 3 months ago. The thing that was neither authority nor tenderness, but some third thing she still didn't have a name for. "I'll bring him," he said. The council chamber was a room she knew. She had sat in it as Luna for 3 years, always at the margin, always at the informational edge of decisions she had shaped and then watched be made as though she hadn't. She knew every face that turned when she walked in. She watched them turn now and read what she found there. Shock in 2 of them, calculation in 3, and in the eyes of the man standing at the far end of the room. Breton, who had been in the records room and had been found there by Darian's guard and brought, and who was now looking at her across the chamber with the expression of a man who has been outraced by something he underestimated, something that was the closest thing to fear she had ever seen in his face. She had a letter sewn into her clothing. She had a man with translated notes standing behind her right shoulder. She had documentation from Alva waiting in Fennec's hand at the chamber door. She looked at Breton across the room. And Breton, who had spent 8 months preparing the tribunal that destroyed her life, who had built a case from silence and forgeries and discharged witnesses and the careful management of a king's blind spots, opened his mouth and said, "This woman has no standing." "Pell," she said, cutting across him. Pell stepped forward, and in the particular quality of silence that followed, the silence of a chamber full of alpha lords and council members, and a king who had been waiting for 3 months to understand what he had let happen, Rowan saw Breton's face do the thing that faces do when the calculation goes finally and irrevocably wrong. She had him. They both knew it. The documentation was in the room. The witnesses were in the room. The only question that remained was whether the machinery of justice in this kingdom was capable of doing what it was supposed to do, or whether it was too compromised, too entangled with the man who had run it for 6 years, to function correctly. And it was at that exact moment, Pell's notes unfolded on the council table, Alva's documentation being passed from Fennec's hands to the council recorders, Breton's face doing the thing it was doing, that the chamber doors at the far end opened. Not Darian's guard, not Torin. A man in road clothes, traveling mud still on his boots, with the particular pallor of someone who had ridden hard with urgent news and arrived at the exact moment the urgent news became insufficient. He crossed to Darian and spoke directly into his ear. She watched Darian's face change, watched the thing that had been resolute and present and moving in the right direction go somewhere else, go to a place that was not the chamber, not this moment, not the confrontation that was finally and completely in her hands. Darian looked up, found her eyes across the room. "Invading force," he said, and his voice had changed, had gone to the frequency of command that she had heard only in genuine emergency in the 2 years of border crises before everything collapsed. "Northern Ridge, they're inside the territory boundary. They hit the garrison at Crest Pass an hour ago." The chamber erupted. She stood in the center of the noise and felt everything she had built, the documentation, the witnesses, the 3 months of construction, continue to exist, intact, present, and simultaneously insufficient for what the next 60 seconds were going to require. Breton was still in the room. The invading force was inside the boundary. Her sons were in the outer courtyard with Petra and 6 of Fennec's riders. She looked at Darian, and Darian looked at her with the face of a man who has just understood that the woman standing across from him is the only person in this room who has been operating at full capacity for the last 3 months, and that whatever he thought he was managing when he let her walk out that gate, he was wrong about it. He had been wrong about it from the beginning, and the proof of it was standing in front of him holding enough evidence to bring down his high counselor while simultaneously being the only alpha blood the Northern Ridge crisis had not surprised. "Rowan," he said. One word, her name. The same way he had called it in the forest, stripped of everything except what it was. She was already moving toward the door. She was already moving toward the door when Darian's hand came down on the council table and the room went quiet the way rooms go quiet when the man who controls them stops performing control and starts using it. "Everyone out except Rowan Pell and Lord Fennec," he said. "Breton stays." The chamber emptied in under a minute. She watched the council members file out with the focused efficiency of men who understood that the mathematics of this room had just shifted and that being present for what came next was a liability rather than an advantage. The 2 she had read as calculating went last, which told her they were still calculating, still trying to determine which side of whatever was coming would leave them standing. Breton did not sit. He stood at the far end of the table with his hands at his sides and his face arranged in the expression he defaulted to when cornered. Not panic, something drier than panic. The expression of a man running an internal audit of his remaining options and finding the inventory lower than expected. Darian looked at him across the length of the table. "The invading force at Crest Pass," Darian said. His voice was very quiet. The quietness was not calm. It was the compression of something that had a great deal of force behind it. "Who provided them the pass coordinates?" Breton said nothing. "The garrison at Crest Pass operates on a rotation schedule," Darian said. "That schedule is classified to council level and above. The invading force hit the garrison at its minimum strength, 3 hours into the rotation shift, when the incoming unit hasn't yet reached full position." He paused. "That's not luck. That's knowledge." You're making a key... Pell, Darian said. Pell opened his translated notes on the table. His hands were shaking slightly, and he was making no effort to hide it, which Rowan found honest in a way that steadied her own hands by contrast. He found the relevant section and read the date aloud, and then the notation. A meeting. Breton's private office. A man whose name appeared twice in Alva's boundary documentation under a different context, and the subject of the meeting as Pell had recorded it in his cipher 30 months ago. Northern pass access, seasonal rotation, vulnerability windows. The silence that followed had a specific weight. It was the weight of something that had been suspended for a long time finally coming down. Breton looked at Pell, then at the notes, then at Rowan. A former employee with a personal grievance, he said. His voice had gone to the register of a man who knows the argument is insufficient and is making it anyway because the alternative is to say nothing, and saying nothing is an admission. A woman with every motivation to fabricate Seraphine's letter, Rowan said. She reached into her clothing and laid it on the table. Her handwriting, dated, describing a meeting in the East Wing communication corridor that she was not authorized to access. The meeting pertains to the dispatch schedule that was altered before Crestwall. She laid Alva's documentation beside it. Boundary fraud, your surveyor, 3 witnesses. She laid Pell's translated pages beside that. The counter order, your dictation, my forged signature. She looked at Breton and did not raise her voice. There was no need to raise it. The room was completely still, and everything she was saying was landing in that stillness with the precision of objects placed rather than thrown. You built a case against me from forgeries, she said, and then you built a case against my sons, which is the thing that ended whatever patience I had left for doing this the slow way. She looked at him steadily. You were afraid of what they would become. You were right to be. Breton's jaw worked once. Then he looked at Darian. Everything I did, he said, and there was something in his voice she hadn't heard before. Not remorse, not confession, but a kind of terrible earnestness. The earnestness of a man who has been so thoroughly convinced by his own logic that the exposure of it genuinely surprises him. Everything I did was for the stability of this kingdom. She was an outside element. Her sons represent a power claim that divides. They are my sons, Darian said. 2 words. Darian's voice had gone to a place so stripped of everything except the thing itself that the room seemed to contract around it. Breton stopped. You manipulated my counsel, Darian said. You manipulated my court. You forged my Luna's signature on an order that killed 47 of my men, and then you stood in my courtyard and helped strip her of everything while I... He stopped. His jaw was tight. He was choosing his words with the precision of a man who has been thinking about this moment for some time and is now in it, and finding that precision is harder than he anticipated. While I let you. The last 3 words fell into the room like stones into still water. Breton said nothing. The invading force at Crest Pass was handled by morning. Rowan was not part of that action. It was a military response, Darian's commanders moving through channels she was no longer formally part of. But she tracked it through Torin, who moved between the council chamber and the war room with the efficiency of a man who had been doing 2 jobs for 3 months and had finally been permitted to do them in the same building. The invading force had entered on intelligence that was 6 weeks old. The vulnerability window they'd been given predated the garrison reinforcement Darian had quietly ordered when the Eastern Lord's messages started arriving through Torin's route. They hit a position that was no longer as weak as their information suggested, and they were repelled within 6 hours. Breton was confined to the keep's eastern holding room before midday. Not a cell, the legal process required more than a night's documentation before formal detention, but a room with a guard on the door and no access to the records hall. Rowan noted the distinction without comment. She had learned that the gap between what should happen and what the machinery of power would actually execute on a given day was where everything complicated lived, and that closing that gap required patience. She had rebuilt from scratch over 3 months in the cold. The tribunal, the real one, the one with documentation, took 4 days to convene formally. In those 4 days, she slept in a room in the keep's guest wing because she was not the Luna and she would not pretend to be. And she fed her sons and watched them in the gray morning light of a winter that was finally and genuinely breaking, and she thought about the shape of what came next. Cale and Lucienne were 3 months old. Cale had started doing something with his hands, a grasping motion, deliberate, reaching toward objects with more intention than reflex. Lucienne had laughed, a real laugh, sudden and complete, startling both of them. She had been explaining the keep's Eastern water management system to him, because she was running out of topics, and he had looked at her with his dark, measuring eyes and then laughed, and she had laughed too, and it had been the first time in 3 months that laughter had happened in her body without something else happening alongside it. She took that as information. Darian came to her on the second evening. He knocked, which was a thing she noted. He had never knocked on doors in his own keep before, had never needed to, had moved through every space in this building with the assumption of belonging that was so complete it looked like ease. Knocking was a learned behavior. Recent. She opened the door. He looked at the boys who were asleep in the center of the bed in the arrangement of blankets that Petra had engineered with the competence of someone who had been doing this under difficult conditions for 3 months. Then he looked at her face. "Can I come in?" he said. She stepped back from the door. He sat in the chair near the window, not because she indicated it, but because it was the chair that was furthest from the bed, which told her he was trying to calibrate distance deliberately. She sat on the edge of the trunk at the foot of the bed and looked at him. The quiet between them was different from the quiet in the forest. That quiet had been pressurized, loaded with the weight of what had just happened and what was still in motion. This quiet was something else. The quiet of a reckoning that had been coming for months and had now, with the immediate crises handled, arrived at its actual moment. "I need to say it plainly," he said, "not as an explanation, just as a thing that is true." She waited. "I knew Seraphine was lying," he said, "not completely, not the specific mechanics of it, but I knew there was something wrong with the case Breton was building, and I let it build because—" He stopped. His hands were on the chair arms, the same position as the tribunal, and she thought he probably didn't know that. "Because it was easier. Because dealing with what I knew about Seraphine and what that meant was harder than letting the structure Breton built stand. Because I am a man who is better at deciding things than at sitting in the discomfort of what decisions cost." He looked at her steadily. "That is not an excuse. It's an accounting." She thought about what to say for a moment. Then she said, "I know." He looked at her. "I knew it in the courtyard," she said. "I knew it when you looked at me. You weren't cruel. Cruel would have been easier to understand." She looked at her hands. "You were absent. You were somewhere else already, somewhere that had decided and was just waiting for the event to catch up. That's what I've been living with for 3 months. Not that you chose wrong, but that you already weren't there." The silence that came after that was the longest one. It went past uncomfortable into something that was almost clean, the silence of 2 people who have stopped performing anything and are sitting in the actual situation. "I'm not going to ask you to come back," he said. She looked at him. "I know what it would cost you," he said, "to stand in this keep as the Luna after what happened in this courtyard. I know every lord who attended that tribunal would be watching for what it means, whether it means weakness, forgiveness, politics. I know you've spent 3 months building something that belongs entirely to you, and that returning to a title returns you to a structure that—" He stopped. "That failed you, completely. And I built that structure." She was quiet for a long moment. Outside the window, the keep's upper courtyard was lit by torches, and she could see 2 of Darian's guard on their evening route, moving at the same pace they had moved for years. "What are you asking for?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I'm not asking for anything. I came to tell you that I understand why you're not the Luna anymore, and that I will not put any pressure on that, legal, political, or otherwise. Cale and Lucienne are my sons, and I want to know them, and I will earn that, whatever it requires, on whatever timeline you set." He looked at the boys sleeping. "That's it. That's all I came to say." She studied his face. The man who had sat in the chair at the tribunal and looked somewhere to her left. The man who had ridden into a winter forest and given her a name and a direction because it was the only thing he had left. She had spent 3 months being absolutely clear about who that man was, and she was still clear about it, and what she was seeing across the room did not erase the clarity. but it sat alongside it in a way she hadn't fully anticipated. People were not singular. That was the thing exile had taught her that the palace never had. A person could be the man who failed you completely, and also the man sitting in a chair near a window trying to be honest about it. Both were true. Holding both didn't require her to act on either. "The boys will know you," she said. That was never in question. She paused. "What happens after the tribunal is complete and Breton is dealt with?" "I don't know yet. I'm not making any decisions about what this looks like when the ground stops moving." He nodded. "Once. Slow." "That's fair?" "It's not fair," she said. "It's just what's true." He looked at her a moment longer. Then he stood. He looked at Cale and Lucien one more time, that involuntary drop of the eyes, that movement in the jaw, and then he walked to the door. "The Eastern Lords," he said, with his hand on the frame. "The boundary cases. Alva's petition. I'm going to review them without Breton's recommendation structure." "I know you are," she said. He left. She sat on the trunk for a while after the door closed, in the room with her sleeping sons and the torch-lit courtyard outside and the particular silence of a building that had stopped pretending everything was fine and was now doing the slower, harder work of being what it actually was. She thought about her father, who she had not permitted herself to think about for 3 months, because thinking about him was a blade she could not afford in motion. She thought about what he had told her the summer she was 14, sitting on the border wall of his small lord's keep, watching the tree line. He had said, "The people who survive the worst things are not the ones who are hardest. They're the ones who know what they're made of before the worst thing arrives." She had not known, at 14, that this was information rather than abstraction. She knew now. The tribunal convened on the 4th morning. Rowan sat not at the council table but in the witness position, the chair at the room's side that was reserved for people who had information to offer rather than decisions to make. She had chosen this deliberately. She was not the Luna. She was a witness, a petitioner, and the mother of the kingdom's future alpha heirs, and those 3 things were enough. They were more than enough. Breton's case collapsed in the specific way that carefully constructed false structures collapse, not from the outside but from the inside, each piece pulling the adjacent pieces down once the foundational ones were gone. Pell's testimony on the counterorder was the foundation. Once that was established, the handwriting expert who had declared Seraphine's letter a forgery was recalled and re-examined, and under re-examination with Pell's documentation as context, he revised his assessment with the pain deficiency of a man who has been well paid and is now deciding whether continued payment is possible from a collapsing source. It was not. Seraphine's letter stood. Alva's boundary documentation stood. By midday, the chamber had moved from evidence to verdict, which took 2 additional hours of procedural process that Rowan spent in the antechamber with her sons, walking the room slowly with Cale against her shoulder, while Lucien watched from Petra's arms with the measuring attention he had been born with. She talked to them in a low voice, not about what was happening in the chamber, but about what she intended to do after. She told them about the Eastern Territory Network and what it had demonstrated about how power actually moved. She told them about Vane and Sura and the difference between authority that was granted and competence that was built. She told them about the man named Holt, who had added more to the saddlebags than she'd asked for. She told them that the world they were going to inherit was not the world as it had been described to her, and that this was not a tragedy. It was information, and information was the only foundation that held. Breton was stripped of his title and removed from the council before the afternoon light shifted. The formal charges would take months to prosecute fully. That was the nature of the machinery. It ground slowly. But the removal was immediate, and it was public, and it was recorded in the kingdom's formal documents in language that Rowan had reviewed the night before and found adequate. She found it adequate, not satisfying. Adequate. She had learned the difference. The council chamber had mostly emptied when Darian came to where she was standing near the tall window that looked out over the northern ridge. He stood beside her, not close, at the distance of a man who has been told where the lines are and is respecting them. Below, in the outer courtyard, she could see Kyle and Lucien in Petra's arms in a bar of afternoon light that had finally actually begun to carry warmth in it. Petra was walking them in a slow circle. Cale had his face turned toward the light. "The Eastern Lords want a formal hearing on the boundary cases," Darian said. "I know. Alva sent word this morning." "I'd like your input on the composition of the review panel," he said. She looked at him briefly, then back at the window. "I'll put something together." "The council seat," he said, "the one that's open. I'm not offering it to you as—" He stopped. "I'm not using it as anything other than what it is. The seat is open, and you know this court and this territory better than any person I could appoint." He paused. "Think about it." She thought about the white dress, the courtyard, the flagstones under her bare feet, the gate closing. She thought about the gray mare and the first 100 yards into the dark, and the moment she had unwrapped Lucien's blanket and wrapped her feet in it and stood back up and kept walking. "I'll think about it," she said. In the weeks that followed, the keep reorganized itself around the fact of what had happened, which is what institutions do. They absorb and redistribute, and they never look exactly like they did before, but they also never look entirely different. New council members were appointed through a process Rowan reviewed and recommended modifications to. The boundary cases went to a panel that included 2 of Alva's people, which was a precedent that hadn't existed before, and would take years to fully understand the implications of. Torrin was formally recognized for his conduct, in language that did not describe what he had actually done, but acknowledged that something had been done that deserved acknowledgement, which was the most the official record could manage, and was enough for the actual record. Cale and Lucien turned 4 months old on a morning when the keep's courtyard had mud in it from the first real spring rain, and Rowan carried them out into it before anyone was awake and stood in the wet air and felt the season that had been postponing itself finally commit. She had not taken the council seat. She had deferred it, not declined, deferred. She was learning the value of not foreclosing on things before she understood their shape. The woman who had walked out the gate in a white dress had believed that survival meant getting through the next hour. The woman standing in the spring mud with her sons understood something more complicated, that survival was not a destination, but a practice, and that the practice required her to keep looking at the full situation without deciding what it meant before it had finished becoming. Darian came down to the courtyard an hour later before the household was moving in the quiet that a building has before it starts its day. He stopped when he saw her. She looked at him across the courtyard. Mud, spring air, the sound of the first birds in the keep's upper garden attempting to establish something. She did not know what would happen. She was not going to pretend to know. What she knew was this. She had 2 sons who had been born on the coldest night of the year into a world that tried to erase them before they could speak, and they were going to grow up watching how she moved through the aftermath of that. Not what she told them. Not the lessons she intended. What they would carry was how she chose to stand in the courtyard, what she decided to build, who she decided to be when the ground stopped moving, and the work of being a person rather than a crisis replaced the work of surviving. She had been reduced to nothing. She had found out what nothing contained. It turned out to contain quite a lot. Cale made a sound against her shoulder, the focused, exploratory sound that was becoming his signature, that constant examination of whatever was in his immediate field of experience. She turned so he could see the courtyard, the mud, the gate, the ridge beyond it, where the snow had been and was no longer. "There it is," she said to him. "All of it. Right there." He looked at it with his dark, serious eyes. Then Lucien laughed. Sudden and complete, the same way as the first time, startling the morning. A jay lifted from the upper garden wall and resettled 6 feet along it, affronted. Darian, across the courtyard, looked at his sons, and something in his face did what it always did it, that opened and then managed itself and then settled into something that was not pretending to be anything other than what it was. She watched him do it. Then she turned back to the ridge and the spring morning and the work of the next hour, which was all she had ever had and all she had ever needed.